Black Sea Fleet is like the poorer version or the poorer brother sister of the Northern Fleet, right? And it's never had any focus whatsoever because there's never been much going on there. And Ukraine has exposed that totally. And of course, it's not like you can bring other ships in order to replace whatever's there because Turkey isn't going to let that happen. So I think they've been found exceptionally wanting. And the piece for me with this is command and control. So naval leadership clearly doesn't know how to deal with this and doesn't have any idea what it's going to do. And everything they do is responsive. That means they have no control over the sea lines of communications. They have no control over anything. And it's been done by a country without a navy.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're going to look back at the naval war between Ukraine and Russia. And who better is there to be chatting about this than Ryan Ramsey? Ryan, former submarine captain, you commanded HMS Turbulent, a Royal Navy nuclear-powered attack submarine, and that was back in 2011. And you've published, your book is titled SSN 14. And of course, you taught on the hardest military course on the globe, I think, which is the Perisher's course, which is globally recognised as one of the toughest maritime courses in the world. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
Now, this has been an interesting year for the naval war in many different ways. And over the past 12 months, it's evolved from a battle for the Black Sea into a global campaign against the Russian Shadow Fleet and the first ever use of an uncrewed underwater vehicle, by the sounds of things. We had the Novi Rossiyuk UUV strike just days ago, where Ukraine claimed its first ever strike on a Kilo-class submarine using an uncrewed underwater vehicle. As a former submarine captain, how significant is this? That a non-naval power has managed to breach what should have been a protected harbour and attack such a high-value target?
Well, I think it's an absolute step change. You see lots of work going on in the West with UUVs, but it's almost sped everything up. If Ukraine put a UUV through a defended harbour, and let's assume it was defended, and managed to detonate it on a submarine, it sort of collapses the whole thing of port sanctuary. It just doesn't exist. So now they've got an undersea lethality that the Russians don't know how to counter. And in fact, I suspect there are many nations worldwide thinking, how are we going to counter this capability?
Now, this silent threat that comes in, let's put this into context. The Kilo-class submarine, a diesel-electric boat, but it's used to launch caliber missiles. From your perspective, how difficult is it for Ukraine to track these black holes when they're submerged? And do you think that this means that the ports are the vulnerable targets that they look at? And do we protect our boats in a way that against this potential threat, or is this something that's going to come home to haunt us?
Well, I'll take the second part of that first. We do protect against that potential capability. So Fasline's got a big barrier around it, so you couldn't get in effectively. So we've done that, which is why I find it quite surprising that the Russians didn't do the same. Their defences, when you look at the visuals of the ports, there doesn't appear to be anything. It's just crazy free entrance. If we go back to the Kilo class, so the Kilo class is a diesel electric submarine. When it's not charging when it's on its batteries and not charging them, it is very, very quiet. And if you imagine, the Black Sea is a very noisy environment. So acoustically, it is very, very difficult to detect them. And the reality is Ukraine has no ability to be able to detect them that way. When they launch caliber missiles, they still have command and control. It's a lot like Tomahawk. So periscope needs to be up. You need to be in communications before you're launching these things. And that's the only way that gives the Ukrainians the opportunity to be able to detect it. Find the periscope, which is very, very small in a cluttered space, and you find the Kilo class, and then you have to work out how you're going to deal with them.
Now that ties in, the need for a good ISR capability. The Ukrainians, they don't have a navy, they don't have a naval capability. They might have some sea-based ISR or things that they put on recaptured oil and gas platforms and otherwise, or they might have an ISR capability from a drone. But how difficult would it be to find that periscope that's up just pre-launch, or do you think they will be relying on assistance from Western intelligence?
I think very much that we should assume that Western intelligence is helping Ukraine with this. I mean, many Western nations have committed to some form of resource, but not the aggressive resource that they want in order to drive the Russians out, particularly. There's chance detections as well. So, for example, it could get spotted by a merchant vessel or a fishing vessel, and that fishing vessel or merchant vessel calls up Ukrainian authorities and says, I see a periscope in this position here. And the only thing that periscope can be is the kilo class. So that shows where it is.
Interesting. But, over the last year, Ukraine has significantly changed the posture of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. We've seen it move from Sevastopol across to the Russian base at Novorossiysk when the Ukrainians have effectively closed down any ports in Crimea through attacks directly into the port, and we're now seeing that ports on Russia's home territory are effectively rendering the Black Sea Fleet completely impotent and almost confined to port. From a naval commander's perspective, how significant is this?
I mean, it's really interesting. The Black Sea Fleet is like the poorer version or the poorer brother sister of the Northern Fleet, right? And it's never had any focus whatsoever because there's never been much going on there. And Ukraine has exposed that totally. And of course, it's not like you can bring other ships in order to replace whatever's there because Turkey isn't going to let that happen. So I think they've been found exceptionally wanting. And the piece for me with this is command and control. So naval leadership clearly doesn't know how to deal with this and doesn't have any idea what it's going to do. And everything they do is responsive. That means they have no control over the sea lines of communications. They have no control over anything. And it's been done by a country without a navy. I mean, that's really significant.
Yeah, well, we've seen the no control of the sea lines of communications because there have been 2 Shadow Fleet tankers targeted in the Black Sea. But we're also seeing Shadow Fleet tankers now being targeted in the Mediterranean and off the coast of Africa and elsewhere. A, is that legal? And B, how significant is that, do you think?
Well, I think it's really significant because it moves the fight from out of the Black Sea into other areas. And then how far do you go with this? You're talking about attacking something in the English Channel just because you think it might be taking stuff down. It could gradually escalate massively if they get this wrong. I think the legalities of it are really interesting because it's almost like a preemptive strike, isn't it? And sometimes you have to ask whether that's legal or not under international law. But then the reality is the Ukrainian war has never been fought under international law, particularly anyway. But, Russia aren't abiding by Geneva Convention when they do stuff. So why shouldn't we respond symmetrically to the way the Russians might do this? We always hammer ourselves and put ourselves into a corner by fighting within rules that other people aren't following. And the Ukrainians are choosing not to do that.
Well, yes, I suppose if they're it's a war and they're a combatant and they're contributing in some way, then it's a legitimate target even under international law, and the Russians are waking up to that. One of the other things that we've seen, and this goes back to more than a year ago, but we had the sinking of the Moskva in the very early days. You taught Perisher, the next generation of submarine captains. From your perspective, are large surface ships like the Moskva now effectively obsolete in a drone-saturated environment, as we seem to be having in the maritime environment?
Well, I wouldn't say that they're dead because the old operating model is dead, definitely. Big ships are now as vulnerable as small ships. They're single points of failure. Wherever it's a single point of failure in a drone-saturated environment, that's a massive issue for any potential commander of a task force. So for me, survivability is now about dispersion. It's all about deception. It's about layered defense. There's all these things that we once talked about but never really put into practice, and we just need to move faster and faster. The West definitely needs to think differently about how it's dealing with this.
Well, the West thinking differently and moving differently. But what is the lessons that have come out from the Black Sea Fleet? Can we apply those sort of weaknesses to the rest of the Russian fleet in different parts of the world?
So slightly different because in reality, the Northern Fleet is upgrading its surface combatants with the exception of the carrier, which I think they've said that's dead now, finally. But they've spent huge amounts of money on the Northern Fleet, and also the Pacific Fleet will be doing the same because the rise of US becoming Pacific centric, and they need to be ready for that. whereas they haven't spent much on the Black Sea at all. And I think you can't compare the Black Sea Fleet with the Northern Fleet or the Pacific Fleet.
And is that down to command and control? Is that down to investment? Is that is that down to the types of vessels that are in the different fleets?
Yeah, significant investment, and the fact that the submarine forces for them are really, really important, and they invest huge amounts of money and expertise into both those fleets. Very, very capable submarines operating both in the North Atlantic, the Barents, and also in the Pacific.
Now, the other sea that we've seen action in is one that would prove very difficult to get access to, and that's the Caspian Sea. We've had some Russian fast patrol boats attacked by aerial drones in there. Again, is that something that is significant, and can we pull any lessons out of that for how we're going to get our defences sorted in the future for our naval vessels?
Yeah, well, there are some real lessons to be learned out. I mean, when I was doing advanced command and staff course in the early 2000s, geography had a huge part to play in this. So you'd turn around and go, right, well, we'll discount that because nothing can happen there. And what this shows now is that using much smaller vessels, using UUVs, using drones, actually the ranges that they can go to, there's nothing that's not deniable. Effectively, everything's got access, and therefore you have to, and that turns everything into a front line, and you have to plan around that. So I think it's a major, I'm not going to say headache, but it's a major challenge for any potential force that's planning global operations now.
So, from your perspective, over the last 12 months, what have been the significant events, naval events, that have raised your eyebrows and gone, "Oh, that's interesting"? And how would you then adapt the lessons that are coming out of that? If you're designing your perisher course, what lessons would you bring into that?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question. So when I was running the perisher course, we adapted it. We adapted the perisher course because things changed so much in the 2010s effectively, and we changed the course significantly to match that. But it didn't change the underlying requirements that you needed. It's all about leadership and decision making and making the right decisions in a really, really complex environment. But now, over the last year, I think the complexity of everything is got more significant and therefore more difficult to decide with loads more data. And that for me is a really big thing. I think the premise of overrating your enemy, that's one thing that I recognize from what Ukraine has done against the Russians in the Black Sea, and then undervaluing the intelligence that comes from any event that happens. I mean, when the Moskva was sank, and I know this months and months ago, that would have just been, I mean, the shock of that was absolutely incredible. And I always used to say, if that happened in the West and we lost one ship, it wouldn't be like the Falklands War. We'd actually probably stop at that point and go, we can't carry on with this loss and the loss of people that go with it. What are we going to do? But the Russians kept on going, and that showed me the one thing that hasn't changed is how they value life, which they don't particularly, and they will just keep on driving through relentlessly until they beat you down effectively. And then of course Ukraine has just been incredible at the way that its forces have operated and been really agile at changing their tactics all the time. You don't know what they're going to do one day to the next, and that uncertainty needs to feed into any training that happens now.
So are the Russians just effectively using the Black Sea Fleet as platforms to launch cruise missiles into Ukraine as part of their efforts to try and attack Ukrainian critical infrastructure? And from a perisher perspective, you've assessed naval commanders. Give us your scorecard for the Russians.
Well, I think the scorecard's low actually, and the reality is that it's like the First World War, doing the same thing over and over again. Why would you do that and not learning the lessons and not iterating as fast as it needs to? I think my biggest critique of the Russian naval forces is not realizing that actually they need to move at speed. You need to come up with really great ideas very, very quickly, and they're just not doing that. They're just, it's predictable routines. It's slow adaptation at what they're doing. The observe, orientate, decide, act loop that people operate on is so slow and they're just being outsmarted every time.
We've seen drone technology develop rapidly over the last 12 months. We've had the success from the uncrewed surface vessels, and then the uncrewed surface vessels had anti-aircraft missiles on them and have shot down at least a Russian helicopter, if not a Russian fast jet as well. We've now got the uncrewed subsurface vessels that are being used and have been used successfully. Is this where naval warfare is going? What has stood out for you? And do you think the West is going to pick up on these technologies and develop them for themselves?
So automation is significant. I mean, we talked about the Atlantic Bastion, or the First Sea Lord talked about the Atlantic Bastion last week, I think it was. But and the fact is that relies on autonomy in order to achieve success. It gives you loads and loads of numbers. But my counter to this is wherever autonomy is going against something that has people within it, the AI is going to struggle because you can't anticipate everything that particular person is going to do. A Chinese submarine captain will operate differently to a US submarine captain, will operate differently to a UK submarine captain. I operated differently to my counter captain on HMS Talent. We were just very different in the way that we operated because we have personalities, we have ways of doing it. And to gather all that data before you use your autonomous vessels is really, really difficult. I also think it changes the personal dynamic that goes with this. Warfare becomes almost playing Call of Duty. And it becomes more of a game than it does realizing that these are people's lives at risk when you exercise warfare.
Is that a dangerous thing? Do you think that your warfare is moving in a direction, and naval warfare where you've got your large groups of people on a vessel at sea, therefore you're going to get large numbers of casualties whenever things are attacked? Do you think this is taking warfare to a more horrible level than warfare already is at?
I do, and I think when it's autonomy versus autonomous vehicles versus autonomous vehicles, there's there's no people involved in that, crack on. But when it's autonomous vehicles versus vehicles with people in it, that's a real problem for me. And desensitization of warfare, the fact that taking life becomes really, really simple and feels like a game. I think it changes the dynamic massively, and politicians will take more and more risk with this stuff because they just won't recognize the human element that goes with it.
How do we counter that? How do we educate people?
Well, I mean, I go back to if you did the horrors of war. When I did Advanced Command Staff course, going and visiting Auschwitz and hearing stories from people in the Falklands War, it set me for life. I mean, I'd never seen the horrors like that. And it really changed my perception. I don't think our politicians, those that make decisions, have that capability yet to be able to go and do this stuff. So I think there's a whole bit about the reality of armed conflict, so people see it firsthand, maybe experience it firsthand, and then they'll make better decisions about how they deploy the capability.
Well, yeah, it's interesting you say that. I frequently comment and say that the people in the military are probably the biggest pacifists that there are anywhere, because if you've been to war, you know the horrors and you know what it's like. The difference is, if you're in the military, you will fight for peace instead of protesting for peace. And when you're dealing with a bully, protesting and waving a flag in front of them tends not to stop the bully from going and bullying people. But it's interesting you say that. I remember the realities of war bits on Advanced Command and Staff College. I was in course number 1, and we had so John Peters came in, Andy Peters and John Nichols came in talking about their time in the Gulf War and getting shot down, and a few others, and that stuck with me. And when I put conferences together now on terrorism, I bring in the realities of terror, and get terror victims in. Where do you see things going in 2026 from a naval perspective?
Well, I think it's going to be more depletion of the Russian force out there. I think it's going to deplete down to nothing, and I mean it's ineffectual as it is. If they destroy another couple of submarines, the job's done. There's no caliber capability, so they've removed that capability. I think the main focus, though, will be on this: can they reach do they reach a peace settlement that's acceptable? I mean, there's some political stuff that's got to happen. I think they were talking about Zelensky moving on and somebody else coming in, whether that changes the dynamic massively. But I think we shouldn't underestimate that Russia's not going to stop at this. Russia's going to fight to get its old front line back that it had before NATO took on some of the other nations, like Estonia, for example. And I genuinely think within their psyche is that they felt that that was a massive threat to their borders, and therefore they'll do anything to get some of that land back.
So do you think we're going to see more grey zone naval activity from the Russians, from their Baltic fleet, from the Northern Fleet, in around the Baltic Sea, Northern Fleet in around the coasts of the UK and Ireland and elsewhere, trying to influence our critical national infrastructure that's there? Define how influence would be, but we could debate on that separately.
I do think so. So the Northern Fleet have been, resurgent since 2008, and now they're a powerhouse in the Atlantic, which is where they wanted to be. That's got to be countered, and that's really difficult when the US is Pacific focused. And so NATO needs to step up and rapidly and prove that it's in control of all of this. So the First Sea Lord's made some great statements about what he wants to do, but I do worry massively that defence procurement can't move that quickly, and it needs to move really, really fast. And there are solutions out there, but you have to bypass the process, and I don't think the MOD would be ready to bypass that in order to bring on the capability. And then you have to develop the tactics and everything else that goes with it, and that takes time, and we don't have time. With regards to the Baltic Fleet, I think the Baltic Fleet will become more active. There will be incursions in there, because actually all of this, what this does is nations have to respond, and that costs money. I mean, economically, all of this costs huge amounts of money, and that's the only impact they can have on us at the moment. With NATO, of course, they're still importing gas to some countries and stuff like that. They can up the price and control it through energy, but for the UK, they can't control it through energy. So it's about how do they show that they're in control of our own critical national infrastructure, undersea cables and stuff like that, that they've got the influence that they want.
Well, we've seen the rapid procurement for the Royal Navy of some civilian vessels brought into service to deal with the undersea cable threat and to begin to monitor that. You've probably sat underneath the likes of the Russian spy ship, the Yantar, and all the rest of it in different places. Not that you can ever admit to doing that sort of thing. How big a threat are they in reality?
So yeah, I can neither confirm or deny that I've sat underneath any of those vessels, obviously, but they are a threat. I mean, the sensor threat alone, tapping into cables and disrupting communications, or even just seeing what those communications do, that has a massive impact on the UK. Cutting energy cables, I mean, dangerous stuff for them to be doing that, but cutting energy, that's a problem as well. We are an island nation that is now connected to the European mainland for energy, and all of our communications, we all think that we're using Starlink when we're using the internet, but we're not. We're using undersea cables. It's 95%, I think, is undersea cables. You cut off that communications ability, you impact the economy. And so we should be really, really concerned about this and move quickly.
If you were given the opportunity to sit down with General Gwyn Jenkins, maybe you have been, the First Sea Lord, and say, General, these are the naval priorities, from Ryan Ramsey, get on with it, what would you be telling him?
I don't think I'd go so far as get on with it. He's a Royal Marine. You've got to take that into account, right? So I would turn around and say, look broader than your defence primes. Go to those that have got some really, really cool solutions that can be implemented really, really quickly, and you'll have a capability within 6 to 9 months that provides you bastion defence for the Atlantic. If you carry on doing the same as we've always done, which is let's have an idea. I mean, Ajax we could talk about, but let's have an idea and let's take as long as we possibly want to get completely the wrong products, then you're not going to deal with it. And using urgent operational requirements all the time isn't the way. Change the system and move it on. And you're the person to do this, right? So whoever is heading up, change it. They can't say that you can't. You are the senior leader. You can make it happen.
But some of these small companies that are out there, and we were talking about this just before we started to record, some of these small companies that are out there have got absolute geniuses coming up with fantastic ideas and everything else, but they may not necessarily have the right level of maritime warfare experience that's advising them. Is there not a danger that you'll get really good ideas on paper, look like good products, that politicians will go, oh, it's a shiny thing, and then buy something that actually, when you try to use it, isn't as good or as people are making out, or even worse, is completely useless?
Yeah, so I think there's a way around this, right? So the capability needs to be, people come up with great ideas for capability, but unless you understand the environment and you've got some form of tacit knowledge and experience to draw upon, it's not going to work. It might not serve the purpose it needs. And the complexity of the underwater battle space is immense. We talk about environment, oceanography, the weather, other contacts, neutrality, the enemy, rules of engagement, sensor capability. All of these type of things are very, very complex. But there's a load of people who are very capable and have the experience to draw upon. So I'd be looking at, say it was a UUV that was coming in, I'd be asking who have you consulted in order to work out tactics and how it's going to be used. It can't just be about, here's something that detects something, there you go, buy it. It needs to be the whole thing. These are the tactics that you need in order to do that. And that needs people like me and others to be able to turn around and contribute to that.
Now, there's an awful lot of debate going on as to whether the United States pulling out from its close links into NATO would have a massive impact. Do you think if the United States withdrew even further from its NATO commitments, that the European elements of NATO could come together and provide that North Atlantic / Baltic / anywhere else that NATO is interested in level of protection, or are we wholly reliant on levels of US support?
If you say the whole Atlantic, we are absolutely reliant on the US in order to provide some of that. We can't do it alone. The reality is, if you turn around and confine the area, if you turn around and said, I don't know, from the Greenland Iceland gap east, maybe you could do that with just the other NATO units. Bring the French up. There's a whole load. There's enough submarines to be able to do it. And if you supplement that with the UUV capability that they're talking about, then maybe the Atlantic Bastion can be done by NATO forces. And actually, that's actually what we should be planning. We can't rely on the US anymore. The US has said that. I mean, they're going to go Pacific Central, Indo-Pacific Central. They're going to become insular, and I don't see that changing much. This is going to get more and more insular, and therefore we shouldn't be relying on them. We should be relying on ourselves. We used to do this, there was a time when we never relied on anybody except ourselves, and we had the forces to be able to do it. And the reliance on NATO, strength in lots of countries, each country is doing the same thing, which is going, well, I'm just relying on them, when in fact they need to build up their own capability.
And how much of a risk is it that you get your different countries who are not pulling their weight in the maritime environment? I'm thinking in particular here of Ireland, with its coastline out in the Western Atlantic, where it's got no naval capability per se, certainly no ability to detect subsurface threats that are there. Is that seen as a risk, as a threat environment, and is it being exploited by the Russians?
So Ireland's interesting because it's never had much of a naval capability, and it's never much needed it because there's no perceived threat to Ireland itself at the time. But I think things are changing with that. And this comes back to, if you pulled up all the assets that NATO have, and you turned around and said, in the Mediterranean, there are hundreds and hundreds of ships from the likes of Italy, France, Spain. There's loads of them. And the Med isn't as much of a threat as the Atlantic. So if I was the NATO commander, I'd be turning around and going, right, we need to deploy these ASW assets, anti-submarine warfare assets, onto up to Norway or wherever else, or over to the UK, and that's the forward operating base, and that's where they're going to deploy. And we're going to put all these forces together with the UUVs and cover the Atlantic.
Finally, 2026. What do you think is going to be? Is anything going to stand out as something that you would be expecting to see from a change in naval tactics or naval technology that's going to directly impact the war between Russia and Ukraine?
I would expect to see the Russians start to up their game a bit with this, whether they get a change in leadership, whether they try and look for their own UV technology to bring that into the fray, making sure they can bring it via land effectively, and then up the game that way. The attacks on exporting vessels, I worry about the neutrals in this. I think Russia will become more frustrated and might start going down that way. And I'm actually surprised they haven't done already, to be honest, because they don't seem to care about international condemnation or international rules. So that will be their asymmetric threat: hit the Ukrainian economy where they can and deal with it that way. From the other side, I think Ukraine are going to become more innovative about how they're doing things. They'll ramp up stuff as they go. And I don't see any de-escalation unless the politicians manage to achieve something towards the mid-end of the year. It's just going to be either status quo or escalation.
Well, on that sad note, Ryan Ramsey, thank you very much indeed for talking to us in Times Radio Frontline. You are not alone by assessing that this conflict is going to continue all through 2026 and potentially beyond. But thank you for talking to me today.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.